The climactic Battle of Berlin in April and May of 1945 represented the final, brutal crescendo of the Great Patriotic War. The Soviet Red Army, having endured for long years of unimaginable sacrifice, stood poised on the threshold of the Nazi capital. This moment was not merely a military victory, it was the ultimate reckoning for the invasion and devastation inflicted upon the Soviet Union. Every soldier, every tank crew, and every high-ranking officer carried the weight of millions who had perished in the defense of their homeland. For the Marshals leading the colossal assault, the city of Berlin was more than a strategic objective, it was a symbol of vengeance, redemption, and the complete annihilation of the fascist threat. The air was thick with the smell of smoke and gunpowder, a constant, acrid reminder of the desperate, house-to-house fighting that consumed the city's heart. Marshals Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky commanded forces that had advanced relentlessly from the distant Volga and the steppes of Ukraine. Their names would forever be intertwined with the methodical and unyielding destruction of Hitler's final stronghold. The strategic coordination of their three fronts, the 1st Belarusian, 2nd Belarusian, and 1st Ukrainian, was a logistical and military feat unparalleled in history. The Marshals' leadership transformed a defensive struggle for survival into an overwhelming, punitive offensive. As the artillery fire gradually subsided, giving way to the sounds of smaller arms and the cheers of victorious troops, the leaders contemplated the magnitude of their accomplishment. This was the end of a long and bloody road, a journey measured in countless kilometers and an incalculable number of human lives. The final entry into Berlin was less a triumphal procession and more a sober confirmation of the Nazi regime's absolute defeat. The world held its breath, awaiting the official proclamation of victory and the first, powerful pronouncements from the men who had delivered it. Their words, when finally spoken, would be recorded in the annals of history, conveying the full scope of Soviet emotion and intent. The silence that followed the final battles was, in many ways, heavier and more significant than the deafening roar of the preceding weeks of combat. It was a silence filled with the ghosts of the fallen and the stark reality of total war's conclusion. The Marshals prepared to speak, their voices carrying the authority of a nation that had survived the impossible and emerged victorious. The final capture of the Reichstag and the hoisting of the Red Banner signaled not just a local triumph, but the end of the European conflict. The commanders stood among the ruins, the true conquerors, ready to express the thoughts of an entire victorious army. Their statements would be a final, definitive declaration to the world of the immense price of aggression against the Soviet Union. Marshal Georgy Zhukov, commanding the 1st Belarusian front and often regarded as the most formidable of Stalin's generals, possessed a presence that demanded absolute attention and obedience. His commentary upon entering the conquered capital was always anticipated, reflecting the iron will and uncompromising nature of his military doctrine. Zhukov was a man of action, focused less on flowery rhetoric and more on the unvarnished truth of military reality and operational success. He would have viewed the destroyed city not with sentimental pity, but as the inevitable, deserved consequence of an aggressive war started by the enemy. One consistent theme in his known statements was the concept of historical justice, of the invader finally receiving their just and complete defeat on their own soil. He often spoke of the immense strategic lessons learned in the war, lessons that were paid for with the blood of his soldiers. The sight of the defeated German capital confirmed his conviction that superior Soviet strategy and the endurance of the common soldier were ultimately unbreakable forces. Zhukov's entry into Berlin was likely marked by a stern focus on the immediate tasks of securing the city, maintaining discipline, and formalizing the surrender process. His words would likely have centered on the immense logistical achievement of bringing such a massive army to the heart of the Third Reich. He would have acknowledged the immense suffering and sacrifices endured by the people and the army, making the victory a tribute to their resilience. The Marshals' statements rarely indulged in self-praise but consistently elevated the bravery and skill of the troops under his command. He saw the victory in Berlin as the validation of every difficult decision he had made throughout the entire course of the war, from Moscow to the Oder. His initial reaction to the fallen city was probably one of deep professional satisfaction mixed with the solemnity due to such a catastrophic, final conclusion. Zhukov understood better than most that the political implications of their presence in Berlin were as significant as the military ones. Therefore, his words were carefully weighed, serving as both a military bulletin and a political statement on the new European order. He was the man who accepted the final German surrender, making his pronouncements the most authoritative and symbolic of all the Soviet marshals. The victory, for Zhukov, was an affirmation of the Soviet system's ability to defend itself and ultimately crush its enemies. His stern command presence ensured that the final moments of the war were managed with the same cold, calculated efficiency that had defined his entire career. Zhukov's quotes were not about joy, but about duty fulfilled, a massive, bloody task brought to its necessary and final completion. He would be concerned with the practical details of occupation and stabilization, moving quickly from combat victory to administrative control. Marshal Ivan Konev, whose first Ukrainian front had executed a brilliant and rapid encirclement maneuver from the south, approached the final victory with a characteristic dynamism. Konev's personality was perhaps more outwardly expressive than Zhukov's, often reflecting a sense of profound relief and even raw emotion at the war's conclusion. His forces had been involved in some of the most intense and geographically challenging battles of the Eastern Front, earning him a reputation for bold, swift maneuvers. For Konev, seeing the city of Berlin fall must have been a powerful, personal moment, confirming the efficacy of his aggressive, deep penetration tactics. He often emphasized the spirit and morale of the soldiers, recognizing that their unwavering commitment was the true engine of their rapid advance. Konev's statements upon entering Berlin would likely have highlighted the speed and precision of the final operation, underscoring the completeness of the enemy's disarray. He might have spoken about the dramatic contrast between the German boast of a 1,000-year Reich and the swift, ignominious collapse of its capital. His observations often contained a soldier's pride, a powerful acknowledgement of the Red Army's transformation into the most powerful fighting force in the world. Konev's route into Berlin brought his troops through the areas where the fiercest resistance had been concentrated, particularly in the city's southern suburbs. His words would have served to memorialize the specific battles his front had fought, from the rivers of Ukraine to the streets of Germany. He would have made a point of stressing the collaboration and coordination between the different Soviet fronts, seeing the victory as a collective triumph. Konev was known for his ability to connect with the rank and file, and his statements often reflected the common soldier's perspective on the hardships endured and the sweetness of the final win. The Marshals' entry represented the closing of a massive loop, with his forces having pursued the retreating enemy from the earliest days of the war. He would likely have used strong, vivid language to describe the utter devastation of the capital as a testament to the intensity of the struggle. Konev's focus would have been on the decisive nature of the victory, ensuring that the German military was utterly broken and incapable of future aggression. His legacy was one of strategic innovation and relentless pursuit, qualities that found their final vindication in the ruins of Berlin. The Marshal would certainly have paid tribute to the Soviet leadership, especially Stalin, while still reserving genuine praise for his field commanders and troops. He saw the defeat of Germany as a final, permanent blow against the forces that sought to enslave the Slavic peoples. The first words spoken by the Soviet marshals were inevitably shaped by the sheer, overwhelming devastation that met their eyes in Berlin. The city was a landscape of apocalyptic ruin, a sobering monument to the destructive capacity of modern warfare and the final, desperate resistance of the defenders. Every phrase uttered by a marshal was against a backdrop of shattered buildings, burnt-out tanks, and the somber silence of a city brought to its knees. This environment made purely boastful or light-hearted statements inappropriate, grounding all pronouncements in a sense of heavy historical gravity. The marshals, having witnessed the destruction of countless Soviet cities and villages, would have seen Berlin's ruin as a mirror of their own nation's suffering. Their statements were a complex mixture of justified triumph and a weary acknowledgement of the war's immense human cost. They were conscious that their words would be heard not only in Moscow but across the Allied world, and by the defeated German population itself. The immediate priorities of the marshals included securing vital infrastructure, preventing unnecessary bloodshed, and beginning the process of military governance. Therefore, their initial public comments often combined declarations of victory with firm, practical orders for the administration of the conquered territory. They had to project an image of power and control while simultaneously managing the logistics of a massive army occupying a hostile, devastated metropolis. The sheer scale of the German surrender, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers laying down their arms, was a powerful, unspoken context for their words. The marshals were not just military commanders, they were the de facto temporary governors of a massive, conquered territory at the very center of Europe. Their words had the immediate effect of policy, influencing the behavior of millions of people, both Soviet and German, in the newly captured city. They would have consistently referred back to the suffering of the Soviet people as the ultimate justification for the Red Army's presence in the German capital. This emphasis on the moral rightness of their cause gave their pronouncements an authority that went beyond mere military rank. The marshals stood in the ruins as living symbols of the Soviet Union's unimaginable comeback from near-total defeat in 1941. Their statements were a message of finality, signaling to the world that the most aggressive, devastating conflict in human history had finally been concluded. They understood that the battle for Berlin was also the first skirmish of the Cold War, and their every word was scrutinized by their Western allies. The Brandenburg Gate served as the undeniable, iconic center stage for the Soviet victory, a powerful symbol of German nationalism now conquered by a foreign power. The very location magnified the impact of any word spoken by a high-ranking marshal in its immediate vicinity. Passing through the gate, even in its shattered state, was a ritual of profound historical significance for the triumphant Red Army soldiers. The marshals who oversaw or participated in this symbolic moment spoke with the realization that they were making history with every utterance. Their words here often transcended mere military reports, becoming poetic or philosophical reflections on the nature of war and peace. The gate's ruined columns and statuary provided a tangible metaphor for the collapsed structure of the entire Nazi regime and its ideology. Statements made at this location were meant to be circulated widely, to stand as definitive declarations of Soviet triumph for posterity. The marshals' quotes at this site would inevitably reference the long road of retreat and the final, victorious advance that had culminated here. This location also offered an opportunity to contrast the Soviet Union's anti-fascist ideology with the racist, aggressive policies of the defeated Third Reich. The marshals would likely have stressed the liberation aspect of their campaign, framing the Soviet entry as the definitive end to Nazi tyranny over Europe. They were conscious of representing a massive, multinational force, and their statements often sought to unite the various Soviet peoples in the triumph. The victory at the Brandenburg Gate was the moment when the military objective became a political and ideological statement for the world. Zhukov, in particular, would have ensured that the flag-raising ceremonies and symbolic gestures were executed with the utmost military precision and formality. The Marshals' statements confirmed that the entire military structure of the Reich had ceased to exist, replaced by the order of the Soviet command. They spoke not just to their troops, but also to the defeated German populace, setting the tone for the coming occupation and administration. The physical act of standing at the gate, the historical heart of Prussian and German power, gave their words an added resonance and authority. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the last iconic structure to fall, and the Marshals treated the moment with the utmost historical solemnity. Their commentary reflected the dual nature of the victory, a brutal military necessity and a moment of powerful, moral and political affirmation. The messages delivered at the gate were designed to be both triumphant and sobering, recognizing the heavy cost while celebrating the absolute success. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky, who commanded the Second Belarusian Front, was known for his calm, methodical approach and impeccable planning, often earning him the moniker of the Great Strategist. His contribution to the final operation was crucial, as his front secured the northern flank, preventing German reinforcements from reaching the main battle for Berlin. Rokossovsky's statements would characteristically reflect this calculated, logistical perspective, focusing on the successful execution of a complex strategic plan. He would likely have emphasized the precision and coordination required to trap the German forces both within Berlin and in the surrounding areas. His quotes would have been less about emotional release and more about the cold, hard facts of military arithmetic and the perfect culmination of strategy. Rokossovsky's appreciation for the victory would be rooted in the efficiency and low-cost, relatively speaking, nature of his front-specific operation. He often praised the engineering and logistical core, recognizing that a modern war's success is deeply dependent on the unseen efforts behind the front lines. The Marshals' entry into the liberated territories, even if not directly into the city center, was an affirmation of his genius for large-scale maneuver warfare. He would have spoken about the strategic paralysis of the German command, noting how their plans were consistently outmatched by the Soviet operational tempo. Rokossovsky understood the war as a vast, interconnected machine, and his statements would reflect the successful meshing of all its complex parts. His comments upon the final victory served as a professional critique, noting what went right and acknowledging the sheer scale of the Soviet force projection. He would have made a point of recognizing the sacrifices of the Polish army units that fought alongside his forces, underscoring the international nature of the victory. Rokossovsky's calmness under pressure was legendary, and his words would convey a sense of quiet, absolute confidence in the ultimate triumph of the Soviet cause. He focused on the final, irreversible crushing of German military power, a goal that was achieved with clinical and devastating effectiveness. The Marshals' perspective would have been keenly focused on the post-war security, ensuring that the defeated enemy could never again pose a threat. His approach to the victory was strategic and enduring, looking beyond the immediate cheers to the long-term implications for the Soviet Union's security. Rokossovsky's disciplined and reserved nature meant that his pronouncements were powerful not for their bombast, but for their understated, authoritative truth. He saw the fall of Berlin as the ultimate proof of the superiority of the Soviet military planning and the indomitable courage of its multi-ethnic soldiers. The most poignant and often unrecorded words spoken by the Marshals in Berlin were those that addressed the deep, personal hunger for retribution felt by the entire Soviet population and its army. The concept of vengeance was a powerful, driving force throughout the campaign, fueled by the countless atrocities committed by the German forces on Soviet soil. While official pronouncements often focused on political and military objectives, the underlying emotion was one of absolute, justified moral indignation. The Marshals, having seen the systematic destruction of cities like Stalingrad and Kiev, considered the ruin of Berlin to be a necessary, proportional balancing of the scales. Their initial quotes would subtly or overtly reference the destruction of their homeland, making the German capital's demise a reciprocal act of historical justice. The soldiers under their command had carried the burden of this suffering for years, and the Marshals' words gave voice to this immense, collective trauma. Statements would often include phrases about the return of the debt or the fulfillment of the oath to the fallen, linking the victory to a sacred duty. The Soviet command made a conscious effort to channel this raw emotion into effective, focused military action, culminating in the siege of Berlin. The sight of the Reichstag, the symbol of the regime that had orchestrated the invasion, now smoking and scarred, was the physical manifestation of this revenge. The Marshals ensured that the world understood that the Red Army's advance was not merely a territorial conquest but a righteous, punitive expedition. Their words acknowledged the deep reservoir of suffering that had been necessary to achieve this final, decisive victory over an inherently evil regime. This sense of historical reckoning was a powerful element of the Soviet propaganda, and the Marshals were the most credible figures to deliver the final message. They spoke for the millions of civilian victims and the millions of soldiers who had died fighting to bring the war to the enemy's capital. The quotes from the Marshals served to legitimize the full destructive power unleashed on Berlin, framing it as the unavoidable price of German aggression. It was a stark, uncompromising message: those who sow the wind of war will ultimately reap the whirlwind of total defeat and devastation. The Marshals knew their soldiers needed this sense of closure, this final, tangible confirmation that the enemy had been absolutely defeated in their own lair. Their statements were a declaration that the terror inflicted upon the Soviet Union had finally been terminated at its source of origin. The Soviet Marshals' entry into Berlin was not a solitary military event but a massive confrontation between the victors and the shattered remnants of the defeated German populace. The Marshals' public and private statements were therefore keenly aware of this immediate, unavoidable interaction and the need to establish order. Their words had to balance the harsh reality of occupation with the political goal of presenting the Soviet Union as a liberator from Nazism. Konev and Zhukov, in particular, issued early orders concerning the treatment of the civilian population, aiming to maintain discipline and prevent large-scale chaos. The quotes attributed to them often contained stern warnings against looting and unauthorized acts, reflecting a desire to control the narrative of the occupation. They were establishing the framework for the future German state, and their initial pronouncements were the first building blocks of this new political reality. The Marshals would have referenced the distinction between the Nazi regime and the ordinary German people, a necessary, if complicated, political maneuver. Their statement sought to reassure the fearful civilian population that the Red Army was a force of order, not merely one of revenge and chaos. This careful messaging was crucial for the long-term goals of the Soviet Union in establishing a post-war sphere of influence in Central Europe. The Marshals' quotes were a powerful tool for military governance, used to communicate the absolute authority of the new occupying power. They emphasized the futility of continued resistance and the immediate necessity for the population to comply with the Red Army's directives. The pronouncement served as an unofficial military court's verdict, declaring the Nazi regime guilty and its destruction a just and legal act. The Marshals' words were the first formal contact between the new Soviet administration and the masses of civilians suddenly under their rule. They set a precedent for the entire occupation period, emphasizing order, discipline, and the complete disarmament of the civilian populace. Zhukov and his peers understood that the successful control of Berlin depended on the immediate, effective communication of clear, non-negotiable rules. Their statements at this time were less historical reflection and more immediate, urgent instructions for the stabilization of the conquered capital. The Marshals spoke to the German people with the authority of conquerors, but with the necessary political restraint to ensure a functioning post-war city. This diplomatic nuance in their strong military language highlights the political sophistication required of a Soviet marshal in this crucial moment. Behind every word uttered by a Soviet marshal in Berlin was the looming, inescapable shadow and ultimate authority of Joseph Stalin, the Generalissimo. The marshals were not free agents, their pronouncements were carefully aligned with the official, centrally dictated line from the Kremlin. Stalin's own messages to the marshals and the nation served as the definitive template for their public statement on the final victory. The primary themes of Stalin's directives were the complete and unconditional destruction of fascism and the final vindication of the Soviet political system. The marshals' quotes, therefore, acted as echoes and amplifications of the powerful, singular voice of the Soviet Supreme Commander. They consistently ensured that any praise for the victory was first and foremost directed to the wisdom and guidance of the party and its leader. Their speeches were a careful performance of loyalty and political correctness, an essential requirement for survival and advancement in the Soviet system. Any independent or overly personal reflection on the victory would have been considered politically dangerous and immediately suppressed. The marshals in Berlin were the instruments of Stalin's will, the physical agents who had delivered the victory he had demanded. Their statement celebrated the Soviet industrial capacity and the unity of the Soviet peoples, both themes that were central to Stalin's wartime narrative. The victory in Berlin was presented not just as a military success but as a moral and ideological victory for communism over its fascist opponent. The marshals' words ensured that the immense sacrifices were interpreted through the lens of a necessary struggle for the survival of the socialist state. Their initial reports from the field were meticulously scrutinized in Moscow, with their public statements vetted for any deviation from the official line. This political constraint gave their quotes a certain gravitas and formality, making them official documents of Soviet history rather than mere personal reflections. The marshals understood that their greatest service was in executing Stalin's grand strategy, and their words reflected this humble, dutiful acknowledgement. They spoke with the authority of the Red Army, but always under the ultimate, supreme authority of the Generalissimo and the Communist Party. The Battle of Berlin was ultimately a victory of coordinated strategy, involving a triumvirate of the Soviet Union's greatest field commanders, Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky. While Zhukov had the most visible, central role in the final assault, the contributions of the other two marshals were absolutely critical to the overall success. The words spoken by each marshal were subtly different, reflecting their individual personalities and the unique paths their respective fronts had taken to Berlin. Zhukov's quotes were characterized by an emphasis on finality and the unyielding power of the Red Army, a statement of cold, hard military fact. Kohn's pronouncements often carried a sense of dramatic speed and tactical brilliance, reflecting his rapid, aggressive maneuvers in the south. Rokossovsky's statements were generally more reserved and focused on the deep strategic encirclement and the thoroughness of the destruction of the enemy's main forces. Together, their combined statements created a comprehensive, multifaceted narrative of the Soviet victory, covering all strategic and emotional aspects. The Marshals understood that they were part of a legendary military leadership, and their quotes were often crafted to complement and reinforce each other's messages. They were conscious of their collective image, presenting a united front of military prowess and political loyalty to the Kremlin. The victory was too large and too complex for any single commander to claim sole credit, making their combined narrative of coordination essential. The initial reports and subsequent press releases featuring their quotes emphasized the perfect synchronization of the three fronts in the final, decisive battle. This coordinated messaging was a powerful political statement, demonstrating the strength and unity of the Soviet military command structure. The different routes they took to Berlin and the different roles they played ensured that every Soviet soldier and every Soviet nationality felt represented in the final triumph. Their combined words celebrated the collective genius of the General Staff and the supreme execution of the highest orders from the Generalissimo. The Marshals' triumvirate of statements officially closed the chapter on the military campaign, paving the way for the political work of occupation and peace. The Marshals' entry into Berlin immediately shifted their focus from the military victory to the monumental task of securing and administering the defeated city. Their words and actions were directed towards the complex problems that lay beyond the immediate rubble, logistics, governance, and the establishment of order. The statements they made were not merely historical, they were also the first administrative decrees of the Soviet occupation zone. Zhukov, as the senior commander, was quickly appointed to lead the Soviet military administration in Germany, making his words carry immense legal and political weight. His pronouncements immediately after the fall of the city would have addressed the urgent necessity of restoring essential services, such as water, power, and communication. The Marshals had to address the immediate humanitarian crisis, ensuring that the starving and displaced population was stabilized under Soviet control. Their quotes were often phrased as direct, non-negotiable commands, underscoring the shift from combat to the iron-fisted rule of the occupation. They would have used the victory to justify the imposition of Soviet-style political and administrative structures in the eastern sector of the city. The Marshals were keenly aware that their performance in the immediate aftermath of the battle would define the Soviet Union's role in the post-war world. Their statements about the future were cautious but firm, declaring the irreversible end of German militarism and the beginning of a new, Soviet-aligned era. They spoke of the future security of the Soviet state, making it clear that the price of peace was the complete political transformation of the defeated enemy. The logistical genius required to transition an army from a massive offensive operation to a stable occupying force was reflected in the precision of their orders. The Marshals' focus was on consolidating their gains, ensuring that the political victory was as complete and enduring as the military one. Their words were the beginning of the post-war settlement, dividing the spoils and establishing the spheres of influence that would dominate the next for decades. The final words spoken by the Soviet Marshals as the dust settled over Berlin were weighted with the full, immense gravity of the preceding 4 years of conflict. Their pronouncements were not just reports, they were testaments to the most consequential victory in the history of the Russian state and the Soviet Union. The Marshals spoke with the certainty that they had decisively shaped the course of the 20th century, altering the geopolitical landscape forever. Zhukov, Konev, and Rokossovsky had secured a place in the pantheon of military legends, and their words were their final submission to the historical record. Their statements ensured that the Red Army's immense contribution to the defeat of Nazism would never be overlooked or diminished in the West. The quote served as a powerful reminder of the millions of Soviet lives lost, making the victory a profound and somber national memorial. They spoke for the entire Soviet nation, which had borne the primary burden of fighting the vast majority of the German military machine. The Marshals' final statements were a declaration that the sacrifice was worth the result, the absolute destruction of the greatest threat to their nation. They had fulfilled their duty to the party, the people, and the fallen, completing a war of defense that had become a triumphant war of liberation. The historical weight of their words was a formal closure to the greatest military struggle of their lives and an opening to the complex, uncertain peace that lay ahead. Their legacy was secured in the ruins of Berlin, and their final recorded quotes were the definitive summary of the Soviet spirit and its ultimate, unyielding power. The Marshals knew that every word they spoke would be analyzed by future generations, defining the Soviet perspective on the end of World War II. Their voices, strong and resolute, echoed the deep commitment of an entire nation to preventing the recurrence of such a devastating, existential war. The victory in Berlin, as communicated through their decisive words, remains one of the most powerful and enduring moments in military history.